And the recording will be available to everyone on our distribution list. So, first, let me first welcome you on behalf of the Florida chapter of the Scholars Strategy Network. And our event is conducting research to impact policy. My name is Elizabeth Strom. I'm in the School of Public Affairs at University of South Florida. I'm co-leader of this chapter, and my fellow or sister co-leader is Elizabeth Aranda, who's a professor of sociology at USF. You can wave. And we have a graduate fellow, Ate Pentia, who is joining us right now from Brussels. And he's a doctoral student in anthropology. We're pleased to see a number of our Florida chapter members at this meeting. For those of you who are not familiar with the Scholars Strategy Network, it's an organization of university-based scholars who are committed to using research to improve policy and strengthen democracy. And the way that we do this within our chapter is we focus on trainings, workshops, and information sharing to help connect researchers with policymakers, and that's especially at the state level. Also to connect researchers to media and also to each other. We organize this event because we often hear from members and colleagues that they would like to be able to have a voice in the policy conversation, but they're not sure where to start. After all, so many of us came to scholarship because we saw problems that we wanted to help solve. But as many of you know, our academic careers tend to push us towards scholarly publishing, or for many of us, some of you will find this familiar, we sort of fall under the burden of many administrative tasks. And so we've become further and further distanced from those early ambitions. So we've convened today to help all of you make those connections that allow you to translate your research to policy. If you have followed the story of our University of Florida colleagues who are fighting to be able to serve as expert witnesses in an important voting rights trial, you know just how powerful the voices of scholars can be, especially here in the state. So a few housekeeping items before we get to our speakers. First of all, check your email because we've sent you the bios of our speakers and also an information sheet that Ate put together with key points about the Florida legislative process. We also sent you a link to a workshop we did last year about Florida policymaking. You can also use the chat to introduce yourself. You can also use the chat to put down questions that you have. If there are short clarifying questions, we may ask speakers to address them in the course of the program, but mostly we'll be handling those questions in a Q&A. And finally, we'll keep the Zoom meeting open after the program ends. It ends at noon, but we'll stay around longer because some of you may want to have longer conversations or learn more about SSN. And so we as the hosts are happy to stick around. So we have three really amazing panelists. I can't believe how lucky we are to have them here. They are all active in advocating for and making policies that will improve quality of life for Floridians, but they all have a foot in the world of research. Anna Eskamani represents Florida's 47th district in the Florida House of Representatives, and she also is a PhD student in the University of Central Florida Public Affairs Doctoral Program. Sadaf is the CEO of the Florida Policy Institute, and Alexis Tsoukalas is a policy analyst with the Florida Policy Institute and also a PhD student at the UCF Public Affairs Program. So that UCF Public Affairs Program is just obviously producing the best possible researchers who are engaged in policy. So good for you guys. So our first speaker is going to be Representative Eskamani. So I'm going to mute myself and let the representative take the floor.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be in this space. I feel like I'm at home. And so thank you everyone for taking the time on this busy afternoon to kind of unpack what we can do as academics to be more effective and powerful advocates. And I say we because I do feel like I sit in this really interesting place as not only a PhD student, but also as an elected official. And so to shine some more light on my background real quick, I was born and raised in Orlando as a daughter of working class immigrants. My parents came to this country from Iran, but actually at different parts of Iran at different times of their life. And so they called Orlando home because they met each other while working at a donut shop. And my mom recognized my dad's accent, and she asked him what his origin story was. And they started speaking Persian or Farsi, and the rest was history. And so I grew up in a household with not a lot of resources, but education was always paramount for us. Getting good grades was a make it or break it scenario in my childhood. And so I took my academics really seriously. And my dad went to UCF in 1994, became an electrical engineer. And even in that situation, he worked at the Space Coast on the weekdays and worked at Walt Disney World as a customer service representative on the weekends because our family struggled to make ends meet. My mom had a degree from Iran she could not use, so she worked at fast food restaurants, eventually Kmart, and passed away when I was 13 years old after a long fight with cancer. And so my passion for academics is very much grounded in my family experience and just the values that my family placed on academics. And so when I got to UCF myself, I pursued dual major in political science, the international relations track, and then also picked up a second interdisciplinary studies major in women's studies, which is now women gender studies at UCF. But that was my undergraduate foundation. And then I got hired to work at Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida right before I graduated, finishing my undergrad degrees, very entry-level job. And I just felt like I wasn't finished with my academics yet. I love being a student because there is a finish line at some point, when you're in a place of professional work, like every day is a new challenge, and some tasks, especially as elected officials, I'll talk about soon, are never ending. And the beautiful part about academics is like, you do the work, you do the research, and eventually you have the credentials to keep doing more, but it's almost like this finish line that you can aspire towards. And I really love that part of academics, and of course, learning along the way, where you can just be a student and be inquisitive. When you're in a place of public service, you have to know the answers to everything, which I'll talk about soon. And so with that said, I applied for the grad program at UCF. I did the dual masters at UCF, which is a nonprofit management degree alongside the master's in public administration. Then I also picked up a graduate certificate in gender studies, and I was an adjunct at UCF for a little bit before I started my PhD program. And in the middle of that, decided to run for office. So I am still a PhD student, which I hate saying because my entire cohort has finished except me. But what threw me off course was the pandemic. And I think the pandemic not only, takes up a lot of my time as a state representative in responding to this crisis, but it's such a great example of information and science being polarized and politicized for individual gain among politicians. And so with that said, the ways that I try to amplify academics in public service, and I'm excited to see what questions or thoughts folks have. But first of all, I think it's really important that policymakers try to lead with evidence, right? And in my case, like if I need to search for academic articles, I can do that. I have the resources, I have the tool set. But candidly, most of my colleagues have either no experience even reading academic articles or don't see the value in it. So I do think a part of our challenge is breaking our own silos in academics to make information very easy and tangible to understand for an everyday audience. And that, of course, can take shape in different mediums of sharing information. So whether it's infographics or interactive videos or one-pagers versus the 15-page article, or it's storytelling. And I do think storytelling is such an important part of breaking down barriers, because when we can use case studies to amplify an individual story of someone, but then connect it to the macro issue we're trying to solve, it is a way to cut through the BS, if you will, and also help folks that have no academic background, as incredible as folks in this space, still understand where you're coming from, what your points are, and hopefully be more bought into your solution. It was mentioned in the introduction, the controversy with the University of Florida. So I do think that this is where the everyday public also steps up to say, let academics be academics. And one takeaway that I have from that the controversy out of UF is that the everyday public supports academics. There is this anti-elite fervor right now, which we can talk about more if folks want to, but I feel like that exists in like a very like echo chamber type of environment to a select group of people. Now, of course, we need to break through that, obviously. But there are a lot of ways that we can break through that. And I think one of the first ones is, when you're talking to an audience, don't use acronyms, right? Don't use terminology that they're not going to understand. Like I said earlier, like you got to break it down and use storytelling to talk about our values and how that's attached to the research results that we want to share. And as one great example, something Florida is very good at are OPAGA studies. I don't know if anyone here ever looks towards OPAGA studies. It's kind of like our CBO, if you will. It's like a nonpartisan, analysis of policy. And so many OPAGA studies exist by themselves. Like we get emails as lawmakers when new studies come out. I highly doubt most lawmakers read them because they are really dense. And so again, I think we have to be really thoughtful to how do we take the information that's already readily available and break it down into digestible pieces, not just for the policymaker, but also for their constituents. Because at the end of the day, if a lawmaker is going to continuously ignore science, they can't always ignore their constituents. And so one quick example, yesterday we hosted a virtual press conference on tax policy, which, for any of my tax folks in the Zoom room, it is very hard to get people to care about tax policy unless it's like directly impacting them at this moment, right? Like so much of the chatter from those who are more conservative was about what's happening in Congress. And we kept stressing to the audience members, we're not talking about Congress, we're talking about Florida state tax policy, like right in your backyard, right? So not only do we have to combat the noise around a specific topic or issue, but then we also have to just build media excitement around it. And that's hard for issues that are a little more wonky and numbers driven than the social ones that get more attention. And so anyways, I share that because this event, it was, we invited Florida Policy Institute to be part of it because they have a great research lens. We also invited AFL-CIO to be a part of it. And then we had another representative. And so I think that type of structure, right, where you have storytelling, you have intersectionality. So you have a labor voice, you have a research voice, you have a mom voice, you have people of color voice, right? So you also have to kind of think about how do I share my information in a way that is relatable to my audience, and who is my target audience? Because if we're just gonna, what we have mastered writing and communicating to our fellow academics, what we need to master is breaking down that ivory tower and talking to folks in the community at a grassroots level, but also those decision makers. And like I said earlier, sometimes that's a much larger system to decide where do you go first, right? So with that, I will step back and allow the next speakers to give their intro remarks, but really excited to be here and looking forward to going deeper into the conversation.
Thank you so much, Representative Eskamani. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to Sadaf and Alexis. I think you guys are going to present together. Is that right? Okay,
That's
so
right.
I'll go on mute and you can take the floor.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be here. We're really happy to have this conversation because, the more we can make our research and analysis accessible and kind of get into the conversation, the public dialogue, the happier we are. So we're really glad to be talking about our process at FPI. So Alexis, if you could go to the next slide. So just a quick overview of what Alexis and I will be going over today. So a little bit about FPI, who we are, what we do, what we focus on, our research process, skills that we use all the time that may be helpful to you all, and also some tips to help with the framing of research and thinking through how to get it out there into the world. And I apologize in advance, my neighbors are getting all of their windows replaced, so it's a little noisy behind me. All right, next slide. Florida Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. We are committed to advancing state policies and budgets that improve the economic mobility and quality of life for all Floridians. And we do this by analyzing the state budget and revenue. We develop policy solutions, and our real goal is to encourage broad public education and ultimately informed action by Floridians and by policymakers. Next slide, please. And this is sort of how we view all of our work. And the reason why I'm sharing all of this is because it really does inform how we approach our research and how we go about disseminating it and making it usable for our partners and friends. So we begin with our high quality, credible research. We develop policy recommendations. Communications is a big piece of what we do, so educating policymakers and the media and the public. Doing this work in partnership with organizations and advocates across the state and coalitions, and then finally advocating for public policies in Tallahassee to shape a brighter future for all of us in Florida. Next slide. And the way that we kind of envision the future for Florida and how we think about all of our work is through our roadmap to shared prosperity. And this is really kind of our overarching vision for what we need in Florida in order for everyone to live prosperous, safe, healthy lives. And there's 4 buckets: healthy communities, fostering community well-being by investing in education and health, a thriving and resilient economy, spurring sustainable growth by promoting equitable development, investing in smart infrastructure, and improving climate resilience, shared prosperity, advancing shared prosperity by nurturing inclusive communities and building a strong safety net, and finally an equitable tax code. So cleaning up and modernizing our tax code for a strong future. So again, this is our driving vision for the work that we do, and it's really important that all of our research and all of our initiatives that we engage in fit within this framework and all build up toward this broader vision. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about how we prioritize different research topics or advocacy campaigns that we engage in or lead, because there's so much that we can be working on at once. There are so many challenges that we face. There's so many different, bad things that we want to defend against. We really have to be very mindful and intentional about how we allocate our resources, both our time, our staff capacity, our expertise, all of it. So how do we prioritize? Well, number one, as I mentioned, is it aligned with our roadmap? Is this something that is in our wheelhouse? Is it something that feeds into our broader vision for the state of Florida? Florida Policy Institute is also part of a national network of organizations called the State Priorities Partnership Network. It's organized by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in DC, and it's comprised of about 43 other state-level organizations that do similar fiscal policy, advocacy, and research work as we do. And oftentimes, there are policies that are percolating in other states or that the national network is kind of keeping an eye on that may become relevant here in Florida or provide a best practice for us that we can implement here, or that it's something that we know is coming down to Florida as something to defend against. So what's sort of happening at the national level and in other states? This third bullet is really important. Do we have the capacity to take it on? Is it something that, we have the expertise on staff, the energy on staff? Is it going to take us away from our core issues? And finally, is it a place that's appropriate for FPI? What's our specific role in an issue? Oftentimes there are many other advocates who are playing important roles or leading in certain campaigns, and there may not be a role for FPI to play. But if we can find our niche within a broader effort, we will certainly, take that space. But if not, we might just be supportive, but not really engage directly or try to take the lead on something that others are already working on. And that leads to sort of partner engagement. So what are coalitions focusing on that we're a part of? What are our partners doing both during session and during other times of the year? What assistance and data and research do they need to support the work that they're doing, and who leads on an issue? So all of these things kind of go into our assessment of how do we pick what we work on and what we research. So next slide, please. Communications is a huge part of what we do. It's not sort of an afterthought. So we think about the rollout of all the work that we do. And we do several different types of publications, not just full-on research reports, but also we think about, maybe it's actually something that's more appropriate to be a short brief or a fact sheet. Maybe it's something where we do an infographic or a quick blog post, if time is of the essence. An op-ed, bill summaries, these are all different things that we do. And you can see a couple of examples of those over here. Next slide. And then how do we disseminate the information? Is it something that requires a press release? Do we want to do a press call, send out an embargoed version to reporters? How do we do social media? What pieces of the work do we share that we make them into sort of digestible little nuggets to give something longer legs too? Like, we don't want to just publish a report and then it sits on our website and nobody reads it. We like to bring it up, as much as we can, even down the line. If an issue comes up and we've done a report on it or a blog post, we'll point back to it and say, hey, this issue's come up, in this article or in the broader discussion, and here's something we did on it even a couple years ago. Do we do a release on it if it's an issue that a partner is working on? How do we engage our partners in the dissemination of our work? Doing webinars, featuring it in our newsletter. So all these different things are parts of our process that go hand in hand with our research. Next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Alexis now, who's going to pick it up from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Sadaf. Can you all hear me okay? Sadaf, yes? Okay. So yeah, so Sadaf talked more about kind of the big picture and our strategic planning and how we think about things. And I want to drill down more into my thought process and the analyst's thought process when we are actually writing a piece or considering writing a piece. But briefly, before I get into that, I just want to reiterate the skill sets that scholars and PhDs bring to the table that really is relevant to policy analysis. Obviously, critical thinking and technical writing, the ability to synthesize enormous amounts of information into key points and facts, that is huge. And obviously your presentation and education experience, but the two I really want to highlight, and it's really why I decided to go back and get my PhD. I don't think I said it in the beginning, I'm a social worker by education and training. So I started in direct care, but I always loved research and writing. So I ultimately, after starting my policy career, decided to go back for my PhD, partially because I really wanted to get better at the data analysis piece and be able to do more complex microdata analysis and have a better understanding of methods to make our pieces stronger as we go along. And then the credibility. The truth is, having those letters behind your name, PhD or JD, MD, those do lend credibility to what you're saying, especially if you don't already have an established relationship with policymakers or a reputation. Just having that will let them know, at least, hey, I'm worth listening to and considering on this issue. At least you know that I'm an expert and that I've really studied this issue before advocating on it. So those are some things to think about as I start talking about some of the framing that we think about in our writing. So some framing tips. So these are questions we always ask ourselves. So what? Who cares, right? So we think about this in scholarly research. You have your implication section. When you write grants, you have to make a case for support. It's similar, but it's just really considering the stakeholders in various aspects of the policy or the issue you're looking to take on. So do partners care about this? And if they do, what do they think? Are they for it? Are they against it? And what's their reasoning? Similarly, do the people that our partners represent, especially if they're direct service providers, does the larger community or target population care about this? Do working mothers care about this? Do immigrants care about this? Do they not know about it and maybe they should? And then, of course, we can't always know what policymakers are going to think, especially individual policymakers, but you can have an idea of what is the for and against on this issue and what might be a sticking point for policymakers, what might they be hesitant about, what might they be supportive about. And those are things to keep in mind when you're writing and researching as well. And finally, and sometimes the counterpoint or opposition can be any of these groups as well. So not necessarily broken out, but if you're advocating for something, understand who's against it, and don't just dismiss it, understand why, understand their reasoning. Now, when we write pieces, like for example, our minimum wage report that we put out last year before the ballot measure passed, we knew that there was going to be strong business community opposition to the minimum wage because they had already been coming out opposed to it. And they also had done so the last time Florida passed the minimum wage, the last time it was on the ballot in 2004. So specifically, we knew the Florida Chamber and the Restaurant Lobby Association, they might not be about it. And so we really wanted to see, well, what's their reasoning? And let's look at the research that they're looking at and try to make a decision on where we're going to stand on this. So again, if you don't agree with, ultimately, unlike sometimes in scholarly research, policy research, you are taking a side. It is a little bit more opinionated, and you are advocating for or against something, but you still need to weigh the pros and cons and the counterpoints and understand where they're coming from. Because even if you don't bring it up, it's going to come up, and you don't want to be blindsided, and you want to be able to make intelligent arguments. And then the other thing besides just overall relevance and who cares about this issue is why now? So yes, this is something that should have been addressed for many years. Yes, it's something that has been an oversight, but legislators and policymakers also work within short legislative sessions. They're a part-time legislature here in Florida. They're going to want to know why now. So I often try to think about, is there a holiday coming up that we can tie our release into, like Labor Day, for example, anything related to economic justice? It's always good to align it around something like that. Hispanic Heritage Month, if we're talking about immigrant issues or issues that affect the Latinx population. And sometimes there's a separate focusing event. COVID-19 obviously is a huge one that we're still talking about and will be talking about for years. Before that, it was the Great Recession. Those are opportunities, what we call kind of policy windows of opportunity, to step in and use those as an impetus for, this is why now, this is why we need to do it now. I put that quote in there, the idea whose time has come. That's a Victor Hugo quote from one of my favorite books, Les Mis. It's about the French Revolution. And I feel like certain issues too, it's almost like there's just this public momentum behind it. People want it. So regardless of whether there's a focusing event or a holiday to time it into, it's something that you're getting a lot more public momentum around. So it's just a good idea to, if you have something to bring to the table, build on that momentum. I do feel like the minimum wage was one of those issues. The other thing is to keep in mind legislative activities. So one, understanding when the legislature meets. You can go online, look on the websites, look on the calendars. I think the biggest mistake that I made before I started this role, even though I did advocate and I did go to legislative delegations, is if there were issues that I wanted to advocate on, I would often say, okay, well, session starts this month, so that's when I should go talk to legislators. But in reality, you need to start doing that much sooner. You need to plan for your research to get out way ahead of that session. And really, like before committee weeks is the time that you probably want to look to do it here in the state anyway, because most of the bills that are going to be introduced for the session, like for example, we're in committee weeks right now. Pretty much if bills don't get introduced during committee weeks, we're not confident that they will during session. It can happen, it does, but it's rare. So you want to start that thinking about these processes early. But then sometimes there's also a federal piece of legislation or a piece of legislation that happened in a similar state. Like, let's say, well, we're seeing this now, like in Texas, for example, they introduced a bill on abortion. And so now our legislature has some similar bills. So they, there's this policy diffusion that goes on in states, and legislatures feed off each other and look to each other. So if you can use that to your advantage and say, look, this state did this thing that we like, and we want you to consider, maybe Florida should consider it. It makes it easier for legislators to connect the dots, and they don't have to start that infrastructure from scratch. And then sometimes there just might be an issue maybe that's come up and you're not seeing a lot of analysis on it. That's also what we saw with the state minimum wage. So we heard a lot of talking points, both against and in favor early on when the ballot measure first made the ballot. But I wasn't seeing a lot of data. I wasn't seeing, okay, how many people do we think this is actually going to affect? What is that really going to look like for Florida? There's a lot on the national front and there's some in the scholarly literature, but we weren't seeing a specific analysis of that policy. So that's where we felt we could bring a value add and at least bring some data to the conversation. So besides relevance and timing, I guess this is something Rep. Eskamani touched on. So bringing that personal voice in, bringing the voices of those impacted and centering those lived experiences. Traditionally in the policy space, especially before I really got involved in it, it was pretty much hard numbers and analysis. You didn't hear so much about personal stories or kind of that human voice, I felt. And being a social worker, that's just instilled in me that we need to make sure that we're also making that human connection. So for example, in our minimum wage report, we were able to get a quote, thanks to our partners, on how this would help somebody. And so that anyone reading this, policymakers, the public are like, yes, okay, here are the numbers, but let's see, what is this really going to mean for those I serve or those who live in my community? And that doesn't mean you have to put quotes in everything and do strict qualitative research. I know everyone has their research niche in academia, but just thinking about that human element and moving beyond, these are the facts, to this is also why you should care about it, and this is how it will impact everyday people. So we do a lot of also kind of social math, we call it. So for example, if we have a measure that we say, this will put $1,000 in the pockets of low-income Floridians, well, then let's say what that $1,000 could do. You know, can help keep a roof over your head. It can buy you a couple more days of daycare. You know, get food on the table for several weeks, etc. Just those little things are really helpful, I think. But then the big piece, of course, that does matter to legislators is the fiscal impact. One of the questions, if you ever go to advocate for something, is how are we going to pay for that? They might say it's not in the budget. And especially, I think some of my social work scholars and peers get frustrated with this. But the reality is, states do have budgets, and the federal government is able to go into a deficit sometimes, but most state budgets, including Florida's constitution, does not allow them to. So for the most part, it has to be a balanced budget. So if you are going to add something that costs money to serve more people or to add a new department or something, being able to at least estimate that is very helpful. Now, if it gets to the point where it's really on the agenda and it's moving, the state has its own economists and they're going to do their own analysis. So it's not fully on us as advocates or us as researchers to find these specific pay-fors, but it's something to be cognizant of, because even when we've had bills that we champion and we are meeting with legislators or potential co-sponsors, they're asking us, do we have any estimates of this? Because they're in favor of it, but they know they're going to have to argue for that bill. So having that element in mind is very helpful. I think that's especially where the data analysis skills that scholars have can really be useful. And then just one caveat there that I'll say is, yes, states have budgets. Yes, in theory, resources are finite. But one thing we always want to push back on is this scarcity narrative that there's just not enough to take care of everybody. And the reality is, especially, you know, we're always deep in the state budget and the nitty-gritty of it at FPI, is that there is enough to do a lot of the things that we're asking, but it's about priorities. And so certain things are being prioritized and more money is going to them, or less revenue is coming into this area because certain things are not on legislators' radar that we do think should be. So these last couple slides, I'm not going to go over all of these. Of course, you're all professionals and academics. I don't need to give you writing tips per se, but it's more about switching from that kind of scholarly academic writing to something that's a little more palatable for the public and for people who might be completely unfamiliar with your issue. Even policymakers, I mean, they have so many things to try to absorb and understand. I mean, I would say Eskamani is an exception because she really does try to educate herself and understand everything fully, but that's not always the case with legislators. So of course, ask yourself, are you bearing the lead? So this is something we always say. So we try to have like an executive summary in the beginning. Assume nobody will make it past the first page of your presentation or your report or whatever you're doing. That's unfortunate, but just assume that. So people have short attention span, or maybe this is an issue they don't really care about, but they're just skimming it. So any key points that you have, including key figures and data, you can put those right up front in an executive summary. We do that as much as we can. And save that kind of hyper technical writing and academic writing for more scholarly publications. It doesn't mean you can't, you can do both. You can have a scholarly publication that goes into a lot more detail, but then you have a report or a blog or a brief that's more tailored for legislators specifically. One thing too that's very helpful, obviously we have a comms team and we have each other putting eyes on things, but in the end, we're all still policy-minded people. So sometimes I even have like my husband or other family members read my work who are not familiar with policy. And if they understand it and think it's interesting, then I know, okay, maybe the public will and policymakers will. Flesch Kincaid, I'm not sure how, there's probably a better tool now, but that's also something that I've used to kind of estimate the readability of my work. And the last thing I'll just say, of course, as academics, the methodology and how we came to our conclusions, especially if you're including your own original research and not doing like a synthesis of others' research in a report, those are very important, but you don't want to get the main text bogged down with that because people will just lose interest because they're not academics, they're not experts in this. So you can have it, but save most of that for an appendix, put it at the end, hyperlink it somewhere else. And then finally, I'll just say we really try to use visuals strategically. I mean, as you can see, we have lots of colors in ours. But one thing I do too is make the point clear, like put your argument in a heading in your visual. Like for example, here, we want people to know that Latinx and Black Floridians are overrepresented in the domestic workforce. Instead of just like the subheading below it might be a conventional heading, share of workforce by race in Florida. So those are just some examples of keeping things really clean. People want more information, they can always contact you later, or you can hyperlink elsewhere. And then this last slide here, there is a typo in my GIF, but I really wanted to include it. So is your point evident? Sometimes I think I'm saying amazing things and then I go through and read it and I realize I've gone off on a tangent or I've included some really good information, but it's just not appropriate for the argument that I'm trying to make. So again, assume no one reads past page 1, but also take a side, take a stance. I think that's the biggest difference to me, switching from scholarly academic writing, again, depending on your field and depending on what publication you're putting out, but to these policy pieces. Relatedly, you're unlike in academia where you're usually doing a full literature review and saying, this is what everyone has ever said on this issue. I've made sure that I am truly addressing a gap and a need. We're not necessarily going for that comprehensiveness in our work. It's more quick and dirty, and we will definitely consult the literature and use it to support the arguments that we make, but it doesn't have to be comprehensive by any means. And the other thing I showed on the last slide about restating your arguments as headings, you can do that with visuals, but we also try to do that with our subheadings and our pieces. So think for a very traditional research article, if you're an academic, would be, again, depending on the field, but you might have research, methods, discussion, abstract. That's just because that's the order that journals want it and expect it to be in, but we like ours to be more descriptive and actually make some of the points for us, help the reader follow along. So an example from one of our reports is the sole office authorized to enforce the minimum wage has failed to do so. And then we went into our support for that, public records that we got showing that that office had not enforced any, census data that we analyzed showing that wage theft was a problem, and here were the specific groups that it was impacting. And I know we're running up a little bit on time. I think this is my last slide. Yeah, so Sadaf will round us out kind of with knowing all this, what role and partnerships can you all as scholars play going forward? Sadaf?
Yeah, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so, we are always looking to partner um, with academics, with other advocates, and so here are some of the ways that if anyone's interested or would like to learn more about how to do that, here are some of the ways that we could potentially partner. So we, as Alexis just went through, we do a lot of our own data analysis, but we can also, and what we like to do sometimes is take that robust academic research and connect the dots between that and the advocacy that we do in the community partnerships. So we can kind of, if you have a super academic research project or report, and we can sort of help to distill it down into something or use it in our briefs and things like that, then it kind of, helps amplify all of our work together, and then connecting the dots to make sure that it's feeding into our advocacy efforts. Webinars, trainings on the state budget and revenue, if anyone's interested, we do these all the time. If there's a specific policy area that you're interested in, or if you would like to, if you have research that's related, and we could potentially do something jointly. And we also, have access to national experts on various policy issues through the various networks that we're a part of. For public thought leadership, again, panels, presentations, convenings on all these different issue areas. We'd love to be a participant if there's ever a panel discussion. If there's opportunities to collaborate on policy and research projects, we'd love to explore that too, and what that would look like. And then obviously, co-authored op-eds, I think we've done that before, and that's been very great and definitely gives us some different perspective, joining with an academic partner to do that. And then next slide. Yeah, this is our contact information. Feel free to, email any one of us. There's no wrong door. We're happy to talk about how we can work together at any time.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. So what I'm going to do is encourage those of you who have questions. You have a couple of options. You can type it in the chat, and my colleagues Lisa and Ate will sort of facilitate and pose the questions. Or if you'd rather just ask the question yourself, you can use a little hand raise icon to raise your hand, and I hopefully will be able to see the raised hands. But while you're formulating your questions, I'm going to start off with a sort of an overview question for all of our panelists, just to sort of try to drill down and be kind of specific about how academics might be able to start this process of getting their research out there. I'm going to use my colleague Christian Wells as an example, just because I know about his work in brownfields. So Professor Wells is an expert on brownfields and brownfields redevelopment, and let's say he's got this great research that can help inform state policy on how we redevelop brownfields moving forward. So what would be his first step? Should he be looking for the appropriate committee chair in the House or the Senate? Should he be hooking up with an interest group that's working on this? How would you suggest he get started? Maybe I'll ask you, Representative Eskamani, to give the first response.
Absolutely, and it's a great question. So the first thing I would do is identify what level of governments are the best target, right? Because every policy issue, some's going to have more of a state or federal approach. Others might be city, county, school board. So I think your first step is to identify that level of government that's going to be, or multiple levels, but build out your target list, right? Like what are the levels of government that I need to engage with on this specific issue? Because if you meet with a state house rep about something that's locally focused, yes, the education is important, but at the end of the day, that lawmaker might very well not take your meeting or, tell you to go talk to someone else. And you don't want to waste your time or their time when it comes to identifying the right person for that target. The other question you want to ask yourself is sometimes it's not a policy maker, sometimes it's the public administrators. And so this is the difference between policy and rulemaking, right? But there are going to be opportunities. And I always encourage advocates, especially advocates who are more like justice oriented in the political climate of Florida, that you should try to see if there's changes we can make in the rulemaking process first, because it's a lot less partisan. happens more frequently and it doesn't require, legislative approval. So to also consider, is this something I'm trying to change in a actual legislative or ordinance or charter? Or is it a rulemaking or like a different allocation of money that's already been, budgeted for this project, right? So kind of think about those terms too. So once you figure out like the target, then it is the relationship piece. And I do think that setting up an opportunity to meet with that right decision maker is important, but also consider power mapping. And power mapping is something we do in organizing, where you basically try to figure out who's my decision maker and how do I get to them in a meaningful way. And so, for example, your neighbor might be going to the same church as that elected official, and they might have some specific connection that you can leverage. I do think that considering what schools they went to or what schools their kids go to, I mean, it can feel a little like you're, spying a little bit, but you're basically trying to understand like who are the people that interact with this person more than I do that I can potentially look towards for help getting connected. I even do think political donors are important. So if there is someone at the university that has a relationship with elected official for some reason, maybe you ask them to set up the meeting, right? And hopefully there'll be some commonality there over the topic. Of course, in cases like UF, we're seeing the opposite, right? Where political donors are potentially silencing academics, but that is fortunately not always the case. I mean, I know at other universities, political affiliation doesn't impact the use of research. So, and that's the approach we all want to take, right? But with that said, I would also add that relationship building takes time. So I even encourage you that if you're working on something right now, but you don't have results yet, it's not a bad idea to still make those appointments with lawmakers, especially whoever your lawmaker is as a constituent, and build that relationship now, because I think it's also not helpful if you just wait for a crisis or you just wait for data that is immediately released versus kind of give that person an insider perspective of what you're working on and when you hope to reconnect with them. And I think that also helps you build a long-term relationship with someone. So trust is established, because at the end of the day, a lot of this is about trust. And if you also know, for example, that this lawmaker is interested in resiliency and they're not your representative, but you see they've talked on this issue and they've chaired committees on this issue, no reason why not to reach out and say, hey, this is my focus of research. I have an exciting study coming out. I'd love to give you a first glance at it when the results come out, just try to create some sense of connection with that person on issues that they already care about versus you trying to motivate them to care about something they've never expressed interest in. That's also going to be a harder battle. So try to identify who your targets are, build long-term relationships with them. And then the short term, if there are folks that have expressed an interest in what you care about, you might as well try to build that relationship now so you can leverage that in the future.
Thanks, really great response. Sadaf and Alexis, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I would say definitely if there are groups who are advocating for whatever your research is pointing to or is about, like if it's if there's a group working on brownfields redevelopment, I think it would be really worth it to try and find out who those groups are and reach out to them and see if your research can be helpful to whatever advocacy they're doing. I also think it's worth, building those relationships so that you can also figure out, well, you're interested in this issue of brownfields redevelopment or whatever the topic might be or research area might be, but there may be specific research questions that would be helpful to whatever advocacy or messaging or just general efforts that groups are doing, and you might be able to kind of have your research better align with what's most helpful for actually seeing any policy change or movement on whatever issue. And there was a question about the danger, a potential danger in catering research findings. Honestly, I think I don't think you would cater your findings. I think you would have your questions like, does we want to find out if this policy would benefit this population? That's the question you want to answer. And honestly, if we were going, to put in a bunch of our staff time and our energy toward a policy campaign and the research didn't bear it out, that would be helpful for us to know too. So I don't think as catering research findings, that of course is not something we would want to use in our work. Like we don't want to have research supporting our efforts that was in any way biased or specifically designed to get to the answer we want to hear. But I think it is helpful when we have research that tells it either supports what we want to do or helps us redirect or make changes or take a different approach.
Thank you. I'd like to take a question now from Melanie Eskew. You have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Strom. First, I wanted to say a huge thanks to Representative Eskamani, Sadaf, and Alexis. The presentation was really amazing. This is my first time in this sort of setting, really digging into policy and research, and just hearing from all three of you has been really, really engaging and insightful. I actually have a question for Representative Eskamani. First, I want to give you like huge kudos for getting your PhD and being a representative. That's seriously amazing. So like claps over here for you. I'm also really, I actually work with Dr. Aranda, and I think Dr. Castaneda is here or was here. And so our research is intended to kind of hopefully inform some community practice engagement and policy. But as a PhD student myself, I'm interested in hearing your perspective of how you navigate those two spaces, like these two roles that you occupy. So you are a PhD student, but you're also a representative, and you're very much involved in those two spaces. How do you kind of maybe negotiate just those differences of being those two roles in your life? I'm really interested to hear about that.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I have struggled. Even when so to give you all some timeline, I started my PhD program in 2016 with no plan to run for office, like none whatsoever. Like I was working at Planned Parenthood. I was the senior director of public affairs and communications, and have done a lot of my research on health disparities, especially from a woman's lens and people of color. And so that was like very much, my equity hat in nonprofit work, but also in research. And then I made a decision to run for office after President Trump won. And so in 2017, I was now a PhD student and a candidate, which honestly was very challenging too, because there would be moments where, we're facilitating focus groups like in the Orlando area, and it wasn't even area that I was running in. But I was always so worried that somebody might recognize me as a candidate, because that could make it could put a bias in how they answered my questions. So there's just a lot of things you can't control anymore when you're also like, in a place of public recognition compared to being a researcher where you're trying to neutralize everything, right? And approach something without bias. And that's been one of my biggest struggles too, just as a researcher, is to even cancel my own bias, right? Because I come to a space like a little bitter about Tallahassee. I come to a space pretty cynical, about different policy issues and their success in the legislature. And one of the guidance that my professors have had to really stress to me is I have to leave that at the door. And it's why I also love grounded theory, because I love letting our data kind of tell the story and not you placing your own preconceived notions onto data. And obviously that's why like being a researcher is so incredible, because it lets you get out of your head and let the data speak for itself. But even right now, as I embark on dissertation, like I'm talking to my advisors, I need to pick research topics that me interviewing someone is not going to, create bias in my data. So I'm actually using social media data with my research, collecting data that's already available as my primary source, because I know that if I interview people, especially if they're in Florida, they might watch what they're saying to me, because as a legislature, I have leverage, right? Now, candidly, I'm in the minority caucus, so I don't have as much power as others do, but it is something I have to be aware of in these spaces as a researcher to make sure that my bias is not impacting how I analyze data. And then for those participants, that they also don't feel like they have to censor themselves because of who they're talking to. And last thing I'll say, just at a more macro level, I feel really, really lucky that I get to be in these two spaces, because this legislative body likes to attack academics. The UF situation, somewhat fresh in our minds, but let's be clear, it's not the first time. And in particular, Tallahassee recently passed the bill that's basically allowing students to film professors, and requiring a survey tool to be given to professors. And on the House floor, I could ask really tough questions to the representative filing this bill, asking about, well, how is this data going to be reliable and valid? And questions that in academic space, we all know how to talk about these type of operational questions to build a really strong survey tool. They have no idea. So it's really cool to be in a space and kind of flex my research muscles at them, because they're basically making a mockery of science every day, and facilitating bills that are supposed to look objective when they're not. And we can cut that apart when we come into the space, which, by the way, is why we need more PhDs to run for office. Just gonna say that too. I know we can't get too political here. I feel like I've crossed many lines already, but we need more folks with that background in office, because it's so necessary to only come into this space with an idea, with an evidence-based background, but you get so much information thrown at you, and it's handpicked. And if you can't cut through that, then you're not going to make an informed decision. I can't tell you how many times the business lobby comes to us with their polling and their statistics. And if you don't know what a good poll looks like, and how to really look at the tabulations to say, okay, well, how about this trend? Or what do you say about this issue? If you don't have those critical thinking skills, and you're just going to take what they say and go with it. So there's also just a lot of strengths that come with having a research background in a place of legislative service.
Thank you. Other questions? Christian.
Hi, good morning. Thanks again for the brownfields question. Yay. I put in the chat that as FBA president, we work with a lobbyist we write a number of bills every other session, and we work with a lobbyist to get it to committee. So I'm interested to hear about the role of lobbyists and lobbying in general from the panel. Is it effective? Is it annoying? Et cetera. Thank you.
Well, I can speak from FPI's perspective. It's been incredibly helpful for us to have a lobbyist. There's so much we can do on our own, but having that person with their great relationships and insights into what's happening in Tallahassee, not only just to move our bills, but help think through, what can we do in a legislative session? Where should we really put our energy? Where should we throw energy behind, and how we can kind of move things forward? And then also thinking a little bit long term, there may be something we introduce. There always is things that we want to talk about in a session, but we know it's not going to pass or move or whatever. But having that sort of long term vision. So having a lobbyist, I highly recommend it. I think it's been super helpful. I don't know, Anna, maybe you want to speak from your perspective too.
Yeah, I love to. I mean, I agree with Sadaf's response there. I mean, I do think so. The barrier is money, because having a lobbyist does cost money. But I think if that's an expense in your budget, it's definitely not necessary, right? But it does help, because first of all, Tallahassee is very far. So unless you're in the area, which our FSU folks will have that advantage geographically based, but it's just really hard to even make the time to be in the building every day to talk to policymakers, because that's also what it takes. When you get a bill filed, you've already overcome a very huge step in the process, right? That's amazing, especially since state house representatives like myself, we can only file 7 bills a session. So we can't file unlimited bills. Our Senate colleagues can. So a lobbyist can also help you identify a member that will even go to that point to file a bill based on your research and your policy concept. but then it has to get moved to every committee, and a lobbyist, like Sadaf said, has relationships to be able to say, well, I know that chairperson, so I'll get a meeting with you and that kind of stuff. So it definitely does help. But like I said, it's not necessary, but I think if you are trying to get a bill moved, having someone that's full-time to help you and is on the ground, it can also help advocates. Like I think it is important that, you know, storytellers and advocates come up to Tallahassee to support at a grassroots level, and that lobbyist can also, you know, be the host for that group, right? Make sure that they go to the right meetings and have those conversations. And so, yeah, I think that is really helpful. I will say, if you have a good lawmaker that is willing to do the work as a lobbyist, that's also very helpful. Like I have some smaller cities in my district and they cannot afford a lobbyist, right? So I basically become their lobbyist in the sense of what's the bill number? I'll talk to the chair about it. So I think it's you got to leverage whatever relationships you have already, but a lobbyist can help expedite that for you, especially if you're just getting started.
Thank you so much. I'm going to cut in now because I know some people really have to leave. So I'm going to just thank our speakers. For Anna, Sadaf, and Alexis did such a fabulous job. I want to leave you all with a challenge. See if you, in the next few weeks, can identify one way to get yourself more involved in the policy conversation. Maybe it's just looking up the committee chair for the thing you're interested in. Maybe you want to draft an op-ed. We've been working very closely with faculty to help them do that. You know, meet a representative. One small step you can take where you can make your policy speak to a broader audience. And we're going to follow up to see how you're doing and how we can help you achieve those goals. So as I said, I'm keeping the Zoom open so you don't have to run off if you don't have a reason to run off. We'll stick around for further questions, discussion about the Scholar Strategy Network, but I do want to say thanks and goodbye to those who need to leave now.
That was great. That was great.
So for those who are still here, let me, we'll see whether, do you have questions? I see Alexis and Sadaf are still here, which is really great of them. Do you have questions for them or questions about Scholar Strategy Network? Let me know what you have on your mind.
I have a question. I can't figure out how to raise my hand. My name's Jill McCracken, and I do have to jump off soon, but I would like to learn more about the Scholar Strategy Network and how you guys work with faculty and all of this conversation. How do we learn more about that?
So we will put you on our mailing list so that you'll get information about the stuff we're doing. We'll also send a link to the national organization, and we've had it in the chat, but the way that Zoom chat works, you lose it if you're not there the moment it goes up. So we'll send that to you. You can learn more about becoming a member of the national organization, which is something that Danielle works with, but we'll also tell you more about our chapter. So I'd say we'll follow up with you and provide you with the information that you have. Since you registered, we'll have your contact information.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just saw the link that was posted as well. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Other questions about our chapter or about more general about policy? So because I would say that we'd be really eager to work with you guys more because it seems like we're sort of interested in similar things, but from different perspectives. We're all folks who have faculty positions, or most of us do, but we kind of do what you're doing, but you know, in a different institutional setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I can share, well, if you go on our website, you can see all the different research areas that we work in, and I'm going to share our legislative agenda too, so you can see more specifically, you know, what we have coming down this upcoming session. But yeah, if there's ever an area that there overlaps, you know, what we're working on, what your interests are, please feel free to reach out, because we'd love to find ways to partner, or, you know, there have been times where we've been looking for interns as well. So we want to make sure that, you know, when we do have those opportunities to bring on an intern, that we're getting those opportunities to as wide an applicant pool as possible, and expand opportunities to work at FPI to as many people as we can. So for sure, just even if you're not quite sure, just reach out and we can talk about it, and at least stay in touch for any future opportunities.
Sure, that would be great. I'd say, you know, our members and the people who come to our events have such a really hugely wide policy interest. So it's made it a little bit hard for us to say, well, yes, we do tax policy, or yes, we do,
Yeah.
because there's really, we even have surveyed, and it's sort of like, you know, 25 scholars, 25 policy areas. And so we look for ways to sort of connect the people that we know that are in our network to organizations like yours, or maybe think about co-sponsoring events where we're bringing together scholars and policymakers. So those are directions we can go in.
For sure. Yeah, we're hoping to, you know, do more webinars and panel type of discussions next year too. And we'd love to have, you know, ideally it would be great to have FPI and like a community partner, and then an academic perspective, and, you know, all sort of contributing to the conversation. That would be really great.
Yeah, we'd like that too. Lisa and Ate, anything you wanted to add or to ask?
No, I just want to draw attention to the note from Danielle to Jill, who's still on the call, that if you're interested in becoming a member, to reach out to Danielle. Her email is in the chat. But thank you all this has been so eye-opening for me, and I've been involved with SSN for a few years now, but it's just really helpful.
Any other questions? Okay, then I guess we can sign off. We'll follow up with thank yous, and we do really appreciate Sadaf and Alexis. You guys were awesome. We really appreciate what you've done. So take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us. It was great to spend some time with y'all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your week.
You too.